Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about, where you're coming from?
Yes, well, I'm from a place where it's a little earlier in the morning than in Ohio. I'm actually calling you today from Berkeley, California. I actually work down in the Central Valley of California. I am an assistant professor of education for Bard College. Bard College's Master of Arts in Teaching program. And some of you might be familiar with Bard College. It is a small liberal arts school up in upstate New York. But we have opened a campus in Central California, which is where I work right now. And any second now I might be getting a cup of coffee from upstairs, which will be helpful. Great to see all of you. I'm just thrilled to be speaking to a group of teachers. It's my understanding that you're all teachers. And that's how I got my own start in all of this. I was an elementary school teacher in California for 7 years before going on to do my doctorate. And I did Spanish bilingual work in the elementary school ranks. And it really got me interested in this whole issue of getting to know my students better, which led to a lot of the scholarship I now do in issues of Latin American schooling and immigration. So I applaud all of you for taking this time out. I know your summertime is precious, and so I really applaud you taking the time now to do this work to get to know more about your students. I'm really interested if some of you could just tell me a little bit about yourselves, where you teach and the grade levels that you teach.
My name is Reginald Carrington, and I teach in Columbus City at a school called Wallen Park, which is a year-round school. It's in the Ohio State sort of corridor, and I teach first grade.
All right, so you're an elementary school teacher. Fantastic. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I'm Casey Sanders, and I'm an elementary vocal music teacher, and I'm in various schools in the Columbus City school system.
Okay, great.
My name is Roger Brond, and I teach high school physics and physical science.
Right, where do you teach that?
In Columbus City schools at a school called Eastmore Academy High School.
Okay. All right, great to meet you.
I guess I'm next. I don't know if you can see me, I'm in the back. But my name is Julie, and I teach, I'm switching schools, but I teach high school Spanish.
Uh-huh. And so all of you are Columbus City schools? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, got it. All right. Thanks, great to meet you.
Hi, I'm Leslie Landis. I also teach in Columbus City Schools, but I'm starting and I'm also moving. I'm taking a new position in what is considered the ESL school, Columbus Global Academy. So I'll be teaching Spanish 1 and 2 and Spanish 1 and 2 for heritage speakers.
Okay, great. Another Spanish teacher. Uh-huh.
I'm Marcia. I also teach high school Spanish at Marion Franklin High School.
All right. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you also.
Hi, my name is Josh Garriott, and I do English as a second language, kindergarten through 6th grade at Linden Elementary, which is Columbus. And I'm trying to come and get that coffee I think you just got delivered.
Yeah, did you all see that?
No, just heard it.
It's the benefit of being at home. My mother brought it to me personally, so very lucky for 7:20 in the morning, yes.
My name is John Vincent. I teach at Dominion Middle School, and I teach high school Spanish in the middle school, so they get high school credit for it in 8th grade. And I also teach 8th grade social studies, which is American history.
Got it. All right.
My name is Jakia Glenn, and I'm actually a speech-language pathologist with Columbus City Schools, and I work with grades K through 5.
Right. Great to meet you.
My name is Andrea, and I'm also a speech-language therapist, and I work with middle and high school.
Fabulous.
Yo me llamo Margarita Rebolledo, yo nací en Colombia y yo he vivido aquí en los Estados Unidos durante 50 años. Yo tengo 4 hijos y 11 nietos.
Muy bien, mucho gusto.
Un placer.
Well, is that everybody? Is there somebody else back there I can't see?
Well, they're us hangers-on that have organized this event. I'm Carol Robinson from the Center for Latin American Studies, and I'm the administrator on this team.
Right, great. Well, this is a fabulous project.
Oh, and
anybody else I'm missing?
yes, one more.
Oh, I'm Siduri Christensen. Oh yeah, you can see me now. Siduri Christensen. I'm a PhD student at Ohio State University, and I'm the instructor, one of the instructors for this class.
And Erica, we need to get Erica in on this. Erica is the person that's brought you to...
Of course, Erica. Hi, Erica.
That's it.
Erica's been a very important person in this process. Hey. Well, I was really excited to see all the different levels that are represented here today and different topic areas. See that a lot of you already are working in issues of language or intercultural education. That's fabulous. I myself have been, I started off as an elementary school teacher, but now actually I train secondary school teachers in California, and usually history and social studies teachers. But though I also do some work with teachers teaching heritage Spanish programs here in California. And so in Columbus, my understanding is you have a growing, I don't know much about Ohio, to tell you the honest truth, but can you just tell me a little bit about the Latino population? Is it a growing population in Ohio right now?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Specifically Columbus.
Specifically Columbus. And are these families from all over Latin America? Or are there specific countries that are well represented?
Predominantly Mexico.
Uh-huh.
Some Puerto Rican, and then it's mattering from all the other countries.
Okay. So predominantly Mexico.
Yeah.
And can you say anything about percent growth in your schools, maybe over the last decade or so? Has there been a large increase in the schools in the past decade?
Without quoting any specific data, yes, there has been a lot of growth in maybe the last even 20 years.
Last 20 years. Okay. Great. So I imagine it's similar. I've studied some in Nebraska and some other parts of the Midwest, so it sounds like it's a somewhat similar dynamic. And as you know, here in California, we've had a very long-standing Latino and Mexican-American population, even from the birthplace of this state, as it once was part of Mexico and Spain. Well, fabulous. And how many of you have been, I know some of you are from Latin America, how many of you have been to Latin America personally? Okay. And how many have been to Mexico? All right. Great. So and how many of you speak Spanish? All right. Fabulous. All right. Well, that gives me a good sense of where to start. So can all of you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, what I'm going to present with you today is some field research I've done over about 3 or 4 years now in southern Mexico, in a state known as Oaxaca, which is one of the newer senders of migrants to the United States. And I'll be looking at issues of schooling in this presentation, both in this community of origin and in the community of reception, with a more of a focus on the southern Mexico, but I do have some data to share from you from Southern California, where many migrants from this particular community are coming to the United States. Just to give you a little overview of the presentation, we already did some introductions, and that was really helpful. It was great to hear what you all are doing and hear a little bit about Ohio. Then I'll go through my presentation here, and hopefully hopefully have some time at the end for some question and answers. It's my understanding, Erica, I have until, what is it, 11:30 your time?
Yeah, I think so, something like that.
Okay, so the presentation will probably be roughly 45 minutes, maybe a little less, and hopefully we'll take some time for questions and answers. If you have some burning questions along the way, I'm happy to take those. As I do hope that this is participatory and useful to you.
Just to interrupt real quick, we can actually give you till 12 o'clock, our time.
Oh, you got, okay, so till 12 o'clock. All right, fabulous. So, all right, well, that will ensure that we have some good time for conversation here. And maybe get to some of those important educator questions that I imagine that would be on your mind based on this more contextual look at education in these communities. So, I was asked to give you a couple key questions to think about today and that we will cover in the presentation. And really the first of these that I will focus most centrally on is this issue of what challenges that youth in rural Mexican migrant-sending communities face for staying in school and achieving at high levels in Mexico. And also talk a little bit about the types of resources that they and their families have at their disposal for schooling. This will help to give you a better sense of what schooling looks like in these communities, what levels of education are like, and maybe what the schooling experiences of some of the youth and kids that you have now coming into places like Columbus may have experienced before their migration. That'll be the first issue that we look at using this case study of southern Mexico. The second topic we will cover in a little less depth because I have a lot less data on it, but I do have some real interesting numbers, is on this issue of documentation status upon arrival in the United States for youth. And specifically to look at how this documentation status affects the chances that youth migrants will continue their schooling and finish high school upon migration to the United States. I don't know if this is occurring in Columbus as much as it does in California, but we have a big issue here in California of youth migrants not really even dropping out of school, but not dropping into school because they're entering the labor market directly. And so we will talk a little bit about that and how documentation status ends up affecting that. So those are the main questions that we will kind of be probing today. So now we will transport ourselves. We already are in a kind of a time capsule here. I'm in California, you're all out there in Columbus, but now we will all transport ourselves to San Miguel Tlacotepec, Oaxaca, which is in southern Mexico. You can see it here. Are you able to see my arrow when I move it here?
Yes.
Or no?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it coming up?
We see the arrow, but it's not moving.
Oh, it's not moving, all right. Well, you can see on your screen where San Miguel Tlacotepec is. And as I said, this is a community where I've done quite a bit of field research. And I'm going to use this as a case study to look at some of our main topics for today. I think it's important to point out, you're going to have some other migration researchers in the coming days. I know that Jeffrey Cohen will be speaking to you, as will Joanna Dreby. And it's important to note that San Miguel is not going to be representative of all rural migrant-sending communities in Mexico, but there's going to be many differences between them. But there are dynamics that occur here that happen in many such communities. And one thing to say about Mexico, and I imagine you will hear more about this in the coming days, is that migration from Mexico still predominantly comes from rural areas, though there is an increasing urban character to it. But it still is predominantly rural. And so some of the dynamics we're going to see in this community around migration and schooling will be transferable to many other places where migrants are coming from. So So here's another view of San Miguel Tlacotepec. This is, as I said, it's a small town, about 1,600 people currently. And this is the main square, then the main church that you can see down in rural Mexico. So the economic context of San Miguel Tlacotepec, like many communities from which migration is occurring, especially in rural parts of Latin America, this is a community that has very few employment opportunities. 62% of families work in agriculture or tending to animals, and this is all very low-wage work or sometimes even subsistence level work. 20% make palm products. You can see the picture of the gentleman below is making, I believe, a hammock or something of that sort of palm. And many times that is one of the main industries is making products from palm fronds, which is also a very low wage and very, very little money can come from this type of work. And you also have some small business people, but this is a very small sector of the economy. In San Miguel Tlacotepec, like many other areas from which migration leaves from Mexico, many people there receive remittances for basic expenses. Remittances, as you may know, is money that migrants in the U.S. or in other receiving countries send back to the country of origin. It makes up at least 3% of the gross domestic product of Mexico. But in San Miguel Tlacotepec, 72% of migrants sent money back home during their most recent stay in the United States. And 7% of all adults receive remittances from relatives in the United States. And you can see here in the list the types of expenses that remittances are used for. Food and household expenses are obviously the most important use, but they're also used for many other things, including education, which is something we're going to talk a little bit more as we go forward in this presentation. It can be a very important use of remittances, the money that is sent back from the United States. And I imagine many of the immigrants that you have in Columbus are also participate in the remittance economy with their home countries. Some more contextual information about Tlacotepec is that this is a place where whole families are increasingly migrating together. So you have many parts of the community are like ghost town. It's like a ghost town, basically. A lot of vacant homes. So you can see 31% of houses are now left empty because of migration. And then you can see below the numbers that people have left. You can see how in the 90s, in the 2000s, you've had increasing numbers of migrants leaving from this context. And the remaining population as of 2005 was about 1,696. Just to give you a sense of this absence, in San Diego County, you have nearly 1,000 people from San Miguel Tlacotepec who live there, and there's only 1,696 people left in the town itself. So it's a massive exodus if you think about it. So, so this slide got a little bit funny in my when it changed formats, but this just shows a history of migration from the area. One thing that has been very common in migration from Mexico and many other contexts is that sometimes migration will often start as an internal process where migrants will move internally within their own country for labor opportunities. And from Oaxaca, you had, for many years, migrants traveling east to Veracruz, where there's sugar plantations, and north to Baja California, where there's great agricultural opportunities. But really, since the 1970s, it's been more of an international migration, with migrants heading primarily to San Diego County, but to other contexts. I imagine in your work in the Columbus schools, as you get to know families from a place like Mexico, you probably will get to know many families that are from the same geographic area, if not from the same town, because migration is often a process in which people move together in networks. And this is very much the case with migration from Oaxaca. Demographically, in San Miguel Tlacotepec, in Spanish they now say this is a pueblo of abuelos y nietos. It's a town of grandparents and grandchildren. I mean, look at the number of working age people. You can see the working age population has diminished tremendously. It used to be that men would be absent and women were mostly staying, but working age women have increasingly migrated as well. And so you have a lot of children and a lot of senior citizens, but much less of the group that's in between, which, as you might expect, has some great implications for schooling. So now the topic we all really care about, schooling in this Mexican pueblo, which, as I said, has some dynamics that you'll find through many parts of rural Mexico. To give you a sense of the infrastructure, there is one preschool. Preschool is a 3-year process in Mexico, beginning roughly about age 4 and continuing to about age 7. It includes the year of kindergarten. It is a level that has now been made compulsory in the country, but is not universal yet. There's still a lot of people who do not go to preschool, a little less than 50% last I heard. But it has been made compulsory, and enrollment is growing as preschools are increasingly built. But in San Miguel Tlacotepec, there is a preschool, but not everybody goes to it. There are 2 what are known as primarias, which are elementary schools that go, in the U.S. system, it would be from grade 1 to 6 is basically what primarias cover. There is one secundaria, which is like the old, here in California, we don't really have junior highs too much anymore. We're more of a middle school. We do middle schools now, but secundarias are like the old junior high model in the U.S. of 7th to 9th grade. And then you have one preparatoria, which is like a high school, grades 10 to 12. So the levels, preschool, primaria, and secundaria are compulsory in Mexico. Primaria has become basically universal. Just about everybody completes primaria now, or at least attends primaria. Secundaria is compulsory, yet you still have many who do not complete it. Last I heard, it is in the 70% range of those who are completing secundaria in the nation. And preparatoria, high school, is a level that is not compulsory and usually is an expensive level. The high school in San Miguel Tlacotepec was charged tuition, and was so it was a very expensive proposition for many. And not everybody, many people do not go to preparatoria. So this next slide now gives you a sense of some education indicators. I have numbers on the national level, as well as some other numbers that are regionally based. This will give you a little bit of a sense of kind of where a community like San Miguel Tlacotepec stands as compared to other communities, other parts of Mexico. As you can see, the literacy rate in Mexico nationally is now 90.5%. It has really increased dramatically over the past half century. as there's been increasing international pressures to improve educational access and a great investment in the country in schooling. There's still unequal access for all sociodemographic classes and unequal quality, but the numbers there is a trend upward. Literacy is at 90.5%. And if you look at the federal district, which is Mexico City, which is the most highly educated part of the country, it is 97%. Oaxaca, the state where San Miguel Tlacotepec is located, is one of the poorest states in Mexico and has some of the lowest indicators in terms of schooling. You'll see with Oaxaca, it's 80.6% literacy and only 6.4 average years of schooling. If you compare that to the national numbers and the federal district, you'll see the great discrepancy there. And then San Miguel Tlacotepec, it's only 68.2% literacy rate. And the average years of schooling and attainment are 6.7 years. So this is important to take into account when you're considering if you're working with immigrant families from rural parts of Mexico. It is very likely that many of these families, the parents at least, have very low levels of education, relatively speaking, to what we might be accustomed to here in the United States. And this has a lot to do with schooling opportunities. Though I must say, though, that the trend is going upward in San Miguel Tlacotepec and throughout Mexico. So any questions up to this point about schooling? Is my voice clear?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that's great.
Oh yeah, okay, so very clear. I must be pretty loud then or something. But, good, I'm happy to hear that. Any questions so far about the schooling options in Mexico or in San Miguel Tlacotepec?
I have a question. You
Sure.
said how a lot of parents may not have a lot of schooling.
Yeah.
As a high school teacher, I'm thinking, is it possible I could get kids who have only the primary education and haven't had a middle school, junior high kind of experience, but they're still coming into my high school classes?
So are you telling me that's occurring, or are you asking
No,
me if
I'm
that could
asking, is that likely?
It can happen, but most likely if you are in a middle school, they will have gone up to schooling through a middle school education. A lot of kids now are getting through secundaria, which is up through 9th grade. So it would be a little more rare now to say be in 8th grade and receive a child who only completed 4th or 5th grade. It's possible, but it's less common because secundaria has become much more accessible.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Does it matter the age in which the child will leave to come to San Diego County? Do they hold off until they're of a certain age and then the family moves, or does that not matter?
Well, it really depends. I mean, you have all sorts of situations. You have some families where the two parents are already in the United States and the child might be staying with their grandparent, right? Remember the numbers we saw in terms of the ages. In that case, sometimes the parents will send for their kid who might be in elementary school to come and join them in the United States. But if the individual is migrating themselves on their own volition and not necessarily reuniting with family, they will often stay in school at least through secundaria and then leave then. It's kind of like you finish it's like how some kids in the U.S. might hang in there for high school, but then say that's it, now I'm going to move on into the labor market. And that's certainly a pattern you will see. Finishing secundaria, but being like, okay, once I'm done with this, I am out of here because there is money to be made in the United States. And that's a topic, we're going to get into some more of that in some of the later slides. That's a great question. All right, I'm gonna move forward here. So This next slide just kind of reiterates this upward trend in San Miguel Tlacoaltepec, but increasingly throughout Mexico for increasing educational attainment. As you can see, it's really the age 60 and over, we're only seeing 2.4 years of average education. But once you get up to this age group, the youth of today, these numbers are increasingly showing at least a secundaria completion. So this kind of demonstrates the greater access to educational opportunities that you're seeing in a place like San Miguel Tlacoaltepec, which in some ways is a microcosm for many other parts of Mexico. Another interesting trend here, I mean, what do y'all notice between the males and females here?
Female, they obtain more education.
Yeah, that's right. So you can see over time, there used to be a great gap between males and females in terms of education, but that's really closed now, and girls are increasingly outperforming boys and attaining more schooling in Mexico than boys. So that has changed dramatically, and that has been part of international pressure, but also some very intentional reforms within the system of Mexico, as well as some changing cultural norms about the value of educating girls. So it's another trend that you are seeing in Mexico. So just to give you some historical perspective on how schooling access has changed over time, this was... Oh, you can't miss the slide. I'm happy you got back on it. This was an absolutely wonderful woman we met during our time in San Miguel Tlacoaltepec, who was 84 years old and was telling us about early days of schooling there. And she told us that it was for our own good because our parents didn't have money to buy shoes and give us paper to give us pencils. They didn't have money. That's why they said, "Go hide, kids, go hide." They shoot us away and hid us in the house, wherever there was space. We would hide wherever we could fit until Mom said, "Come out," because the men were gone. So, as you might see here, this woman's talking about an experience of hiding from basically a truant officer, right? And not attending school. Because schooling has always been very expensive in rural Mexico. And in this point in history, it was prohibitively expensive for many families. So it was something that many people stayed away from. But this has changed, as we're seeing, and this is a look at educational aspirations now within the pueblo. 73% of students aspire to finish at least high school. 50% want to go to college. Parents, 90% of them want their children to finish high school. And as I was saying, high school is not compulsory in San Miguel Tlacoaltepec. It costs tuition, it's hard to access for many people, but yet it is something that parents really would like their kids to do, and the students themselves would like to be able to do. 70% of San Miguel Tlacoaltepec parents want their children to go to college. Okay. But as you might know from your work in the U.S., and as we see in many inner city schools, that sometimes aspirations are not met with the attainment we would like to see and the performance we'd like to see. And this is definitely the case in San Miguel Tlacoaltepec. Even though those aspirations were very high, only 65% of Tlacoaltepenses 15 and older have completed lower secondary schooling, which is secundaria. But that number is increasing, like I've been saying. And just the number in green here just shows what that number is for the migrants from the community who now live in the United States, who have the access to more accessible middle schools at times. And 13% of the youth from this community have completed high school, and of their countrymen in the United States, 32% have completed that same level. And only 7% have completed some college. One thing I did not say is that there is really no college very close to Tlacotepeque. Some people do go to college, but many go at least 3 hours away to the next big city where there is a university, or some to the capital city of the state, which is 6 hours away. So there's not really higher education opportunities available. So here's the situation: high aspirations, but relatively low attainment. But it is important to keep in mind that the aspirations are there. And and when we're thinking about these problems of education in any context, it's like, well, how do we get the opportunities to match aspirations, right? Becomes a big issue. So despite this increase in access and the high aspirations, why is it in this community that we're still not seeing higher numbers in terms of educational attainment? Well, one of the biggest factors, as it was in the time of our 84-year-old respondent who we saw, and until today, is that it's a significant expense. You think about, it's interesting, if you see this picture here in this slide, this is an advertisement we saw during our time in San Miguel Tlacotepeque. It's the kind of advertisement you see all over town that basically is advertising loans to attend school. And because schooling expenses are so front-loaded for families, families often have to pull together resources at the beginning of the school year and sometimes have to participate in this market of educational loans. So that just is some of the photo evidence we found of this. In terms of numbers, as you see in the numbers here, average educational spending per month is $21, which might not sound a lot, but it is nearly 10% of average monthly income. Okay, where you're talking about a place where wages are very low, and a lot of your money is only coming in through remittances. This is a pretty major expense, and just to compare this to what happens in the U.S., the migrants from Tlacotepeque who now live in San Diego County only spend 2% of their money on educational expenses. You might wonder, okay, well, why are educational expenses take so much more of somebody's income in rural Mexico than they might in the United States? And some of the answers to this are that uniforms are often required and people pay for uniforms. School supplies are usually not provided, though there is a free textbook program up through lower secondary school, through secundaria, but any auxiliary materials must be bought by parents. And an additional cost is that many of the schools in rural areas are underfinanced. You might be familiar with this from your work in urban education, but underfinancing of schools that need it the most. But there is an underfinancing of education, which leads basically the PTAs, the equivalent of PTAs at school sites, to ask for donations from families to help the school get the supplies that it needs. Sometimes things as simple as a desk or a paint job or a playground might be provided by donations from families. And it's one of these things, a family that does not participate in what are called cooperaciones, there's a lot of shame in not participating in that. There's a lot of social pressure to pay those fees. So the expenses are important, in addition to some of the access issues that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so I've now given kind of a larger context of this migrant community and the schooling here. All of this to serve as kind of maybe a representative, as it not necessarily representative, but a case study of what you might see in many parts of rural Mexico. But I also, when we were doing our research here, we also wanted to look at how migration itself, this phenomenon of migration, might be impacting how schooling happens in this community. So we went on with this research question about what the impact of out-migration was on the educational persistence and attainment of youth in San Miguel Tlacotepeque. So in simple English, this is basically, the fact this is a migratory community and people are coming and going and families are being separated. What effect does this have on students staying in school and how much schooling they end up doing? I'm not going to go too much into the literature on this, but basically there has been previous research looking at this topic, and it's shown that there's a lot of mixed effects. There's ways in which being from a migrant community or migrant family in Mexico can help educational aspirations, grades, and attainment, and there's ways that it can be harmful. And so research has shown many different effects of this. And so it's been all over the board, basically. But to put this in a more simple conceptual sense, some of the ways that you might wonder, okay, well, how would being in a migrant community or being from a migrant family there in Mexico maybe aid the schooling of youth that are there? And one thing is that remittances, because migrants are able to send money back to the community, sometimes remittances help families meet the cost of schooling. And so that youth do not have to participate in the local labor market there. They do not have to work, and now they can afford some of those expenses at schooling. And so one would think with remittances, you might have an increase of educational attainment. This is conceptually how it could occur. But there's also, when you have a lot of migration, and as some of you might expect, there are other dynamics that can be harmful to the ability of kids to stay in school and to do well in school. One of these is, and this actually refers back to a question I received from one of the gentlemen just a little while ago, is this culture of migration that there has become, in communities like San Miguel Tlacotepeque, it has become almost a way of life, a rite of passage for young people to one day work in the United States. You go to school up to a certain level, and then, but my future is really participating in the labor market in the United States. And so participating in this, being surrounded by a culture of migration could lead to some student to a disincentive to stay in school because one sees their future tied up in migration. This is especially can be the case for young men. But also family separation. There can be a psychological cost of this separation, which is something we will look at with some of the testimonies that we will see later on in this presentation. So this was a conceptual model going into this research about how migration might be impacting education in the community. Just to show you the data we collected, we did 821 surveys in the community, basically interviewed everybody in the community between the ages of 15 and 65. And we also interviewed some in San Diego County. And we also had 49 open-ended qualitative interviews. So our findings, and this is without kind of overwhelming you with all the numbers, the statistics, and all of this, that the statistical analyses we ran, but some interesting things here is that we found that being from a migrant household was associated with lower levels of schooling attainment in Tlacotepeque. So if you were from a family where at least one parent was absent in the United States, that was related on average to lower levels of schooling. But this isn't so simple. When you considered remittance income, the money that was sent back from migrants, the families where remittance income was coming in, and the youth had a mother with above average education, their likelihood of completing high school was higher when there were remittances. Okay, so if money was coming in and they had a mother that was relatively well educated, they had a better chance of finishing high school. Another interesting finding is that remittance income was related to higher educational aspirations for the youth who had the less educated mothers. So these were youth who might be predicted to have lower aspirations, but when remittances were coming in, their aspirations appeared to be higher. But we didn't find that their attainment matched the aspirations. But the attainment was higher when the youth was receiving remittances and their mothers had above average levels of education. And another finding, this is from our qualitative data, was that we found that separation appeared to be was necessary for families to receive remittances, but it came at a real high psychological price for students. And we will look at some quotes. Some of them are heartbreaking that look at this dynamic. So anyway, at this point, I know I've gone through a lot of information, and I've kind of switched gears here to this research, and I'm wondering if this is all clear so far. Is there anything I need to clear up at this point? All right, any questions about this?
I have a question. Are there taxes paid on remittances?
For the most part, at the state level, as far as I know, at the state level, there is not. But what happens though is that a big cut from remittances is taken from the carrier of the remittances. We all heard of Western Union, right? Right. There's a Western Union. If you go to most rural communities in Mexico today, especially when there's high levels of migration, you will see a Western Union office right there downtown next to the city hall, basically. And Western Union tends to take a big chunk. From what I understand, it's about 10% of the remittance. So, and it's interesting, some advocates here in the United States and in Mexico have tried to find ways for migrants to send remittances without going through those intermediaries, such as through cell phones, through direct checking accounts that transfer across countries. So there are alternatives that people are looking for, but still most people do send them money through agents such as Western Union that take a nice big chunk. So one conclusion myself and some of my other researchers who worked on this kind of came to is this migration question is kind of a double-edged sword in communities like this in terms of education. There seems to be ways in which it's beneficial to the schooling of those who are remaining behind, but there's ways in which it's really not conducive to increasing levels of education and persistence in school. And so we came to call this a double-edged sword. We interviewed the high school principal in San Miguel Tlacoaltepec, who really kind of summed this up nicely for us. He said, the strengths of the community are that fortunately, these kids have resources to be able to study. Most of their parents are in the North, in the United States, and they have the resources to study. That's one of the strengths. The weakness is that kids see those in the North living better. The students don't want to try hard in their studies because at the end of the day, those who leave for the North can take care of themselves economically. Perhaps they don't improve themselves socially, but they do economically, and that is their goal, money. So this is the perspective of a high school principal, right? That sure, remittances can help with education, but really at the end of the day, the lure of going to the United States is so much that most youth see that as their future. Though some of us might argue that it's not just about money, but there's also this issue of reuniting with loved ones, which is really important to this as well. It's both money and love, as we might want to say. Here's some more testimonies from the town. This is a mother of 5, 39-year-old, who's describing who has a husband who's in the United States who sends money back home. He sends money, not that much, but he knows what the kids need for school. Remittances are the base. He supports us economically with money, and I'm here with the kids supporting them, talking with them so they get a good education. What I most want is for my kids to be educated. Okay, so you can see there's some pain in this statement about not having the husband present, but the remittances, you see how important the remittances are. And when you have a parent that is still at home who really is pushing for education and using this economic source to support that, it can have benefits for the kids. But it's a double-edged sword, right? It comes at a cost. Now here's an 11th grade student I got to know pretty well during my visits. And he told me he was in high school, which is worth noting, right? Because as I noted, many people don't go to high school, but he was in high school, but his goal still is migration. He told me, I hope to go to the United States. I don't want to stay because there aren't many jobs. Okay. So, and this particular student was even probing me. He was asking me a little bit about what happened. So when you get to the border, what do they ask you? What do you need? And so he was looking for, kind of trying to use me as social capital, basically, to kind of find out about the crossing the border, what would it entail. So he was already very concretely thinking about this. This is a younger student, the voice from a younger student. My father asked me if I want to go work with him. I should point out this 4th grade student has a father who's in the United States. So he asked me if I want to go work with him. I say no, and he tells me to try hard in school so I don't end up working, so I can have a career, so I'm not working all day in the heat. Interesting, huh? And this is a narrative you do see, when the child or youth is in constant contact with their parent in the United States, the quantity and quality of that contact might have much to do with what happens with their schooling. If they have a parent in the United States saying, hey, I'm here and I'm sending this money to you, but this is hard work. Coming here as an unskilled migrant is hard work. It'd probably be better for you to study, and I'm going to help you do that. So there's that element of sacrifice that is occurring. And that's another pattern you can see in these communities. It's a very common narrative in a place where I work now, like in Central California in the agricultural fields that get to be 100 degrees in the summer. There's a lot of grapes to be picked. This might be a narrative you would see in these kinds of cases. So back to this culture of migration, this way of life that becomes imbued in these communities. This was a middle school teacher we talked to in San Miguel Tlacotepec, who claimed that parents have the mentality in San Miguel that if their kid does badly in school, the solution is to go to work in the United States. And because they have family members, it makes it even easier, right? So here's where having the social networks in the United States, having family networks in the United States could increase the chances of migration, but also maybe the type of student the child is, or how good the schooling is, how good the quality of the schooling is might impact the future that is seen for him or her. Here's the high school principal again, who we heard from earlier. In the end, that's the problem we have. The students don't care if they take advantage or don't take advantage of their education. Those who are tempted to go to the United States, they just come to school and mess around. When the time comes, they leave. That's the reason they don't try in school. You know, it was interesting when I made my visits to this part of southern Mexico, when I hear migration spoken about by teachers and administrators, it's almost like what you hear in the United States when we're talking about gangs or drugs or other things that might lead students to drop out of school. Migration is really seen as a big issue in this regard. And how do we work against this? Like they feel like there's so many times they're working against the current. Even despite the ways that migration can support schooling, they many times feel they're working against the waves here. So, and just to show the power of this way of life and migration within such a community, we had many migrants and potential migrants in San Miguel Tlacotepeque describe to us what they called the sueño americano, the American dream. And this was a 15-year-old high school student who said, the sueño americano is to go to the United States, work, and come back with money to build a house, a car, and all of that. The middle school assistant principal said parents began putting the idea of going to the United States into kids' minds from elementary to middle school. That makes them leave at the first opportunity. It's the sueño americano, the classic sueño americano. I think that one thing important to point out here is that in many ways this sueño americano that is being described here could almost be described as a sueño mexicano. And the reason I say that is because, as you can see from this testimony from the 15-year-old, the idea is to go to the United States, maybe temporarily, so that you can come home and then later have a better life in Mexico. You come back, you build a house, a car, all of that. And those of you who have gotten to know some of your immigrant families, you may be coming across this some in places like Columbus, where the idea is to go back one day to Mexico or to Colombia or to Guatemala, El Salvador, Peru, that might be the idea, but many times it's not what actually occurs, and there's many reasons for that, but that often is what the original intent is not to go forever, but eventually make your life where you are better. Especially in the Mexico case, you see a lot of that. And to another aspect of this, and we talked a little bit about this already, is this issue of family separation and unification. And, it's a painful thing. You get talking to kids and families in these communities, and you really hear some heartbreaking stories about separation and the pain it causes. The cases we have in which parents are in the United States and the kids are here, many kids turn to alcohol because they don't have any direction, any authority. They don't know what to spend their money on other than alcohol. They're not interested in studying. They don't have anyone who asks how they're doing. Last semester, we had a case of a kid who was a good student, but when his parents and brothers left, his grades went down. He started drinking and got into trouble. So, this in many ways could be one of those worst case scenarios, right, when separation occurs. You know, and it's important to point out that there also are cases of, you know, students that stay behind who have parents in the United States and have a supportive parent at home and have constant loving contact with their parent in the United States and do not experience quite this level of difficulty. But you also have many cases where this does occur. So, you know, so despite what the migration might bring, it also can have this other great difficulty. You know, and many of the students that, especially if you're working at any level you're working at with students with an immigration background, this might have been someplace in their narrative, some history of being separated from family at some point, or even now. Here's a poem that really touched us it was written by a 4th grade teacher in San Miguel Tlacotepec, but he was really channeling how he felt, that some of his students felt who had their parents in the United States. When will I see my father? I'm a child, and I have questions. I see my mom alone every day. Will our family never be together? Dad, I want you here with me. You send money, but it's you I want. And here is an interview we conducted with a 5th grade student in Tlacotepec. We asked him, would you like to go to the United States? He answered, yes. Why? Because I don't want to be alone. Okay? So, it's not always about money that youth might want to migrate, but it also can be about love and wanting to reunite with family, right? One of my favorite migration scholars, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, always describes it. Migration is really a story of money and love. This is an experience of some of the students. So I'm going to talk here for maybe about another 10 minutes. And now I want to switch gears to the United States context.
I have a question.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Is there anything being done in the communities or at an organized level to come against the migration or to at least help the families and the children that are being affected by the migration?
So are there any organized efforts? Well, one thing that happens in many communities in Mexico is the migrants in the United States have set up what are called hometown associations. Hometown associations. And these are associations that work in partnership with their community of origin to use some of the financial resources of migration to better the community, right? We're talking improvements to schools, improvement to infrastructure, this type of thing. But it also sounds like what's embedded in your question is that, is there anything being done on kind of more the social support side of this, right?
Yes.
Around the emotional side. And truthfully, I think very little is being done. I mean, talking to teachers, they feel really powerless about what to do with this. We were actually asked to go to the high school by a teacher and give a presentation to all the 10th graders. Those who they were starting to think, okay, this is the group that is really at the fork in the road, right? And we gave a presentation about life in the United States and about migration, and we really tried to give a balanced view of it. But we were solicited to do that because of some of this powerlessness that educators do feel. And, you know, and one thing that's difficult about this is that even in Mexico has a national curriculum, and migration is touched upon in the curriculum, but it's touched upon in a very impersonal way. It's not necessarily included in a way that talks about, that would speak to the lives of these kids. That, wow, migration might be something your dad is involved in. It might be something that you might do someday, your older brother or sister is involved in. It's treated as a very remote topic and not really covered in any meaningful way in most schools. And that's another missed opportunity. So I think there's a lot of powerlessness felt in many of the families and in the schools around this. That said, I have been to some communities. There's, for example, near Guadalajara, which is in kind of central west Mexico, in a rural community there, I met a group of psychologists, school psychologists, who go from school to school and do provide some support to students around this and try to support families. And there are social workers in some places that do this. But that community where I did see that is a place with more resources. It's closer to a big city, and there are people from the big city who come and provide that type of support. But in a place as remote as San Miguel Tlacotepeque, you really don't see much, unfortunately. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I'm more familiar with the situation in Africa, so I'm thinking of a comparison here, where in Africa I know with immigration, there's a draining of resources, intellectual resources,
yes,
financial resources that could go into investment. And so that immigration results, yes, there's some remittances that come back that can be helpful, but there's also a draining of resources that can make it harder for those communities, those countries to move ahead. And I'm wondering if that's similar with Mexico, if there's a draining of resources that really the remittances don't make up for the loss.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. You know, traditionally in Mexico, the migrants are not as well educated as they are typically from countries like Africa or many Asian countries. You know, the Philippines comes to mind as another place where you have some very highly educated migrants leaving the Philippines. But, you know, there are places like Nigeria, for example, where I know there's a lot of brain drain. Mexico, traditionally there's been less of that because of the labor market segmentation of Mexican migrants. It's not, I mean, in Mexico, it's not the most educated or the least educated that are leaving. It's kind of those who are somewhere in between who are leaving, for the most part. And so in terms of a brain drain, it's not as great as you might see in places like Africa. But this is changing. I'm sure many of you have been following the current drug war in Mexico. And that violence has led to an increased amount of migration of the more highly educated people than you usually have seen, which over the long run, if it continues, could represent more of a brain drain. So, yeah, so typically not, but that is changing, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Any other questions before we talk a little bit about the U.S. side? I bet you're getting hungry for lunch about now, huh? Not too bad. Okay. So, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. side, and we don't have just for a little bit. because we do have some interesting numbers. We did not do the extensive field work on the U.S. side that we did in Mexico, but we did collect surveys and did spend some time there. So I want to introduce to you now what we started calling affectionately as San Miguel del Norte, which was kind of a northern diaspora of people from San Miguel Tlacotepec who had settled in Vista, California, which is right near San Diego. This is a picture from a yearly fundraiser that is held by the migrant community there. It's kind of like one of these hometown associations that I was talking about earlier. Anyway, this fiesta in 2007 in Vista attracted 600 people from the town of San Miguel Tlacotepec. This is a town that only has 1,600 people left in Mexico, but 600 were here in San Diego County for this annual fiesta. So it's huge amount of migration from this one particular town to this one particular city in San Diego County. This is very typical with migration. You will see migrants traveling in networks this way very frequently. Anyway, just to give you a little map of Oaxacans, this is the state, once again, that San Miguel Tlacotepec is part of, and their location within San Diego County. I've never liked the color coding used on this graph, and this was not my choice of color coding, but the areas that are darker here are the areas with a higher concentration. So the northern, this is San Diego. San Diego is kind of lower near the border, and a little bit north of there is where Vista is, and where you have these higher concentrations of immigrants from all of Oaxaca and from San Miguel Tlacotepec. And so, just to give you a few numbers on what happens on the U.S. side, one thing that we see when we've surveyed migrants from this community who have gone to San Diego is that you do see that educational levels are higher. You see this at all age levels. And one reason for this might be that these migrants were maybe slightly more educated to begin with than those that remain behind, but also because of probably greater access to educational opportunity in the United States at higher levels. So you can see the differential. So that in red is the US and the blue is in Mexico. One thing that's really interesting when we look at this community, though, is that who continues, these migrants that migrate as youth, who continues their schooling in the U.S. upon arrival in the U.S., and who finishes high school? These numbers were just astonishing to us. That 89.7% of those who are legal immigrants do continue their schooling if they migrate during school age, but only 34.2% of those without documents. And look at the high school completion. Nearly 3/4 of those with documents complete high school, but less than 1/3 without documents. Just to give you a sense of how this compares nationally, this is nationally the dropout rate for foreign-born Latinos who are undocumented is 40%, and those who are documented is 29%. So there is a discrepancy there. But here, those from San Miguel Tlacotepec, the discrepancy is really quite great. And so having papers or not having papers is a huge issue, and certainly is something to take into account as you do your work. So I don't know. Do any of you? What would be some reasons why those without their papers might not continue their schooling, or who might not go on to finish high school? Can you guys think of any reasons that would be the case?
Maybe they're afraid.
Yes.
Maybe they're afraid of being found out and deported. Possibly.
Yes. Right. They might be fearful of being found out, especially right now when just deportations are up, raids are up. Right. There's a greater fear factor right now. Yeah.
And then that would be consequences for the whole family, not just the student, but probably the student's whole family, whoever the student lives with.
Right. And that brings up another point, is that sometimes it's not even being undocumented yourself as a student, right? It also can be the fact that your parents could be undocumented. That could impact your situation, right? And increase the fear factor, right? So, yeah, fabulous. Other ideas about why undocumented youth might not be completing their schooling or continuing schooling?
One thought is that, you know, completion of high school doesn't necessarily, they're still not going to be able to continue on to college and be accepted into colleges, so they might think, well, yeah, what's the point, to a certain extent.
That's right. It's like a rational economic actor. Like, why should I bother if I'm not going to be able to work, right? If I'm not going to be able to get a social security number, if I'm not going to be able to get financial aid, right?
To go to college, you know, that would be the logical, get your diploma and go on to college. But if that's not even a possibility, they might, you know, logically think, why not? What's the point?
Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas?
Another one might be that they move around so much that they're not in any school long enough to be able to complete the grade, to move up to the next level.
That's a great one. That's one I didn't even think of when I made my slides, but absolutely. And I actually see a lot of that where I live in the Central Valley here in California, where there is a lot of agricultural work. And undocumented people participate in that more, and there could be, right, too much transiency to be able to, you know, make it for it to be easy to stay in school. Great. Any other ideas?
Yeah, they want to help their family, and they want to go back in the field and work with the family.
So family obligation, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, family obligation, and maybe there's a greater economic vulnerability too when you're talking about an undocumented family, right? And so the need to help your family, like you're saying, right, could be greater. Yeah. Yeah, so here's the list I came up with, and I think these are pretty much what all of you came up with, is that there's an economic disincentive for continued investment in schooling, right? Hey, I'm not going to be able to work with a degree. I'm not going to be able to get financial aid for college. What's the point, right? And what I'm able to do now and earn now in the labor market is what I'm going to be able to get, so I may as well do it. But that's one part. One of you brought up the fear factor, right? There's a lot of fear. Even though schools are required in the United States by Supreme Court decision to provide schooling, you cannot deny schooling to undocumented immigrants. But there still is a much fear about being found out at the schooling level, and especially as some of these state initiatives come up where parents are going to be, that even in Georgia, they're going to try to ask parents to provide the documentation status upon entry in the school system, which might not pass constitutional muster at the end of the day, but is another issue, right? And you also brought up the focus on the migrant labor market, right? The need to work and the transiency that might be involved. And also the point that this could be related to greater overall family economic and social vulnerability. You know, there's less resources for schooling. You might have more obligation to help your family. And you might have less of the kind of connections when you are less vulnerable economically and you are moving around less, to be able to know which schools to go to and to get support to do well in school, right? So these are all plausible reasons why we're seeing the numbers we do with the undocumented students. And this is still something that researchers are just beginning to get a grip on. It's very hard to do studies on undocumented populations for obvious reasons, right? In our research in San Diego, it took several months to gain the trust of families that were undocumented to get them to talk to us. And for good reason, right? we can understand that. So it's hard to conduct this research, and so it's just something we're beginning to understand better. But I think we have an idea about what these factors could be. So to end this presentation, I want to return back to a voice from San Miguel Tlacotepec. And this is a mother with her family. And this is one of the families that was doing about as best as you could with the whole migration phenomenon occurring around them, because there was a father in the U.S. Here's a mother who had an 8th grade education, who could provide some support around schooling, and there was frequent contact with the absent parent. But even with this, there's a bittersweet quality to the life. These are her words. Living here alone as a mother with my kids, it's hard, but one does whatever possible to help the kids move forward. My husband can't be here because he has to work, to earn money so that the kids have not even a good life, but a decent life. Because if he were here, we would all be happy because we'd be together, but we'd be in a bad situation economically. And this is kind of the double-edged sword, right, that we talked about. And this could be a narrative, and it could very well be a narrative that you see with the families that you work with at some point in their lives, and even to this day, there could be some aspect of this separation and these sacrifices you make, around migration and economic opportunity. So with that, I will stop and move on into your questions and conversation.
I was wondering about this mother with 5 children.
Yes.
In an example like hers, how long would the father stay gone? Would he leave for 1 year or 5 years, or would he stay through the course of their marriage, or while the children are young? Or does he have a set time that he wants to go and a certain amount of money he wants to raise for his family? Or how does that work?
That's a great question. This particular case, originally this father had a goal of going, I believe he said it was going to be 5 years, and there were some goals around building an addition to the house, and towards maybe eventually starting a business back in Mexico. But I believe that 5 years has gone on longer than 5 years now. And one thing that's interesting about him is that at one point, when he first began his migrations, he would come back every year, once a year, to see his family. There was a yearly fiesta where he would come back for. And it was just something around Christmas time, and many migrants would make this journey at that time. But one thing that has occurred with many migrants, such as this individual, is that as border enforcement has tightened on the U.S. side, and as crackdown on immigration has increased, the ability to go home has also decreased, because you run a greater risk of not being able to get back, or having to pay a high amount in coyote fees. So that's increased this level of separation, right? That you cannot, it's harder for the parents that are in the U.S. to come back and see their families now, which also increases the chances that he might be, hey, eventually I just want you all to get over here somehow so we can be all together. But it's a great question, and I do think it often starts with, 1 year, 2 year, maybe 5 years, and up to this level, but it's hard to get out of that life, because when migrants come to the U.S., they're earning more money than they would in Mexico, but economics are hard on the U.S. side. And then you might have an economic downturn like you do now, where you don't earn much money for a while. Then you have to stay longer until things get better, and things kind of, there's chain reactions like that, right? Yeah.
Could you please help us about the coyote fish market? How much do they charge, and the whole market?
Yeah.
How does it work?
Yes. Well, the coyote fees, we actually asked in our survey how much we we asked those who had migrated within the last 5 years how much they had paid in coyote fees. And coyotes, for you, those of you who may not be familiar with the concept, are kind of human smugglers who you pay money to, and they will find ways to cross the border and give you a safe passage. But they are running between, when we took our survey, between $2,000 and $3,000 was how much it cost to go. So it's a considerable expense, and sometimes the expense is not met right away, right? And sometimes there's forms of of owing debts to coyotes once migrants are in the U.S. that can lead to all sorts of other problems, right? So yeah, it's a significant expense, and it's only gone up as the border crackdowns have occurred. It's not that border enforcement has stopped migrants from coming, it's just made it much harder, much more expensive, and has made it much harder, and has probably decreased the chances that migrants who want to return will, because of, yeah. Yes, in the back.
In reference to kind of the family separation issue, what's or how prevalent is the whole resentment piece for the lack of connection, maybe with the children that were born, and then the father or whichever parent may go and leave those children for an extended amount of time? That's the first question. And the second question, either in the community of origin or reception, how prevalent is infidelity?
Second families.
Yeah, well, that's another great question. You know, this is all like case by case, goes on a case by case basis. You know, you have some families where if it's an absent father or an absent father and mother, they are some of them are very much in contact, have frequent contact, and remain very committed and steady about sending remittances and being in touch. But infidelity does occur. I had one heartbreaking situation where one of the youth I got to know, I believe his voice came up in this presentation, where his hope was to migrate to the United States, not because he wanted to make money necessarily, but because he missed his dad. And he was convinced that once he went to the United States, his dad would hook him up with a job and everything would be great. Well, I asked him, when was the last time you talked to your dad? He said, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And later I talked to the mother, and she basically told me, I haven't heard from him for a couple of years, and all the chisme, all the rumors are that he's taken up with another wife and he started another family. And so this was simply heartbreaking to me, seeing this youth who was so looking forward to joining his father, but maybe naive to the fact that his father may have moved on, right? So this absolutely occurs and does complicate things, but really these patterns of resentment or relative harmony are really a case-by-case basis, right? Based on what happens with that particular migrant and that family.
Thank you.
Now the law with Arizona, how closer is California to copy the law that we have in Arizona now?
So what about the law in Arizona?
Well, actually I don't remember exactly the name, but there has been a law that Arizona passed as far as immigration is concerned.
Yeah.
So do you think that California will be next, or Georgia will be next?
Yeah, well, the Arizona law has been replicated by, there's several states that are kind of jumping on that type of bandwagon of immigration reform. And you have a similar law came up in Utah, I believe Indiana, I know Georgia. And, from my understanding is that the Georgia law, they are right now there's an injunction against the part where somebody who needs to be able to show to a law enforcement agent that they are in the country legally. That has not held up. That's not being held up right now. But the parts around workers, companies that hire workers needing to use E-Verify and verify these documents is being upheld. Another part of the Georgia law that's not being upheld is they were going to criminalize anybody who knowingly helped an undocumented immigrant was going to be criminalized and fined, right? So that right now, there's a court injunction against this. But my guess is that we're only right now, until there is some movement at the national level, we're only going to see more of these types of really what I would describe as draconian local laws, state laws that kind of crack down on immigrants and immigrant families. And until something happens, we're going to see more of this. And it just speaks more to the need of something happening at the national level, a reasonable solution at the national level, a reasonable and humane solution. What's going on in Ohio around this right now?
Maybe, was it 2 years ago, there was a big crackdown on driver's licenses or car ownership, and there were intermediaries that had the car note in their name, but somebody else would actually be driving it and owning that vehicle. And they took that away, and we did have a few people that I knew of through a friend of a friend that ended up going back to Mexico as a result, because they felt too unsafe to not even really legally own the car that they were driving, let alone being here with undocumented status. I'm not sure of any other thing.
So, but there's no Arizona-type law coming up for discussion or anything right now?
Not specifically, but there are issues going on within the state government right now. We're all teachers in Columbus, and we're all members of the Columbus Education Association. And there's been a big push to take away our collective bargaining rights and other things that have gone on. And right now, there's a big ballot initiative that most of us have all signed petitions for to get what the legislature has passed onto a ballot so we can overturn that. And it's looking, knock on wood, hopefully that we are going to prevail. We are going to overturn this draconian law that they just passed. So they are seeing this, so now what they are trying to do is find ways that they can prevent people from having their voices heard. And one of the more recent bills that just went through the Ohio General Assembly was to make everyone show a photo ID to vote. Previously, you could show an electric bill, you could show different forms of, you could show different ways of proving your identity. Now, the only thing that will be accepted is your ID, which prevents people who most likely will vote against this bill from voting. So they're slowly but surely just taking away bits and voices that we have.
Okay. So my understanding is that in Ohio you had a law similar to that of Wisconsin, right? Around the...
Yes, right. At the exact same time.
Additionally, in Butler County, Ohio, which is southwest of Franklin County here in Columbus, there's their sheriff there has been very outspoken over the last several years about the presence of undocumented individuals in the county, and he's linking those things, obviously, as a sheriff to an increase in criminal activity in his county. So he's been very outspoken about that issue.
So is this kind of a copycat of Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona? You guys are familiar with him?
I know who he is. Yes.
Yeah. Kind of been a take no prisoners type in Arizona. Really harsh crackdown of immigrants there. That's interesting. So you do have that in Butler County, you said?
Yes, Butler County Sheriff Richard Jones.
Richard Jones.
Yeah. Could you help us to clarify the difference between refugees and immigrants?
the difference between refugees
An immigrant.
and
Who is a
immigrants?
refugee and who is an immigrant?
Well, there's a legal issue around refugees, right? There can be a general sense of being a refugee, of being displaced because of political unrest or natural disaster and this type of thing, but actually having refugee status in the United States is a legal process which is tied to specific conditions. In terms of Latino immigrants, those who have tended to be granted refugee status have been those who are from Central America, from some of the countries where you had civil wars in the 1980s. Guatemala, for example, El Salvador, you've had cases of legal refugee status for members of those nations. Mexico, even though one might argue that economic distress that you feel in some of these rural communities should give you a right to be a refugee, it's not usually considered that way. So it's not typically given to people from Mexico. Even in this time of great violence, we're not seeing it used. So it's a very specific legal process due to involuntary displacement, right? When you're a refugee versus, say, a labor immigrant.
Yeah, then as a political exile, from Colombia. You can be a political exile from Colombia because the political situation or the drug trafficking. Could we see Mexico becoming to the same level where we will have a lot of immigrants becoming a political exile because of the drug trafficking?
It's possible. You increasingly are going to have exile created by the drug violence there. I don't see in the short term, and I'm not an expert on this matter, but I don't see in the short term that status being granted to Mexicans, at least not in the short term. We'll see where things go. But right now, I don't see it anywhere in in serious discussion. Yeah.
I have a question. Are you finished? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm finished. Thank you.
Percentage-wise, out of total number of people that you used in your research, what percentage was undocumented, and then what percentage was documented, and then how did those documented immigrants receive those documents, and what are the normal ways that they can receive that, papers, if you will?
Yeah, great question. Well, it was a little over 60% were those who were undocumented from our survey. Who are those living in the U.S. Over 60% were undocumented. But those who were documented, many of them were actually those who had benefited either directly or indirectly from the immigration amnesty, I believe in 1986, who was known as IRCA, signed by Ronald Reagan, of all people, but did grant amnesty to undocumented immigrants at that time. And there were ways to tie that to family members over time. So most of the folks I met with papers in this particular community gained the legal status from IRCA. From the last legalization that we had. And you also had some, older, those who had been braceros way back in the day and had other methods by which it happened, but mainly it was that 1986 reform.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just one more question, thank you. Earlier, we talked about parents' roles in education here in the United States when they've immigrated.
Yeah.
While you were in San Miguel, did you get a chance to observe or talk with the parents about what they perceived as their role in their students' education in San Miguel, besides the sending of the money, which was important? Like, what else did they feel was their job?
Yeah, well, it really depended upon who you spoke to, of course. But for example, this mother who I finished my presentation with, our 39-year-old, whose the name I believe we gave her was Marisol, she saw her roles being very expansive, to go to school every day and speak to the teachers about what they were doing, how they were learning, what they were learning, and how her child was behaving. And also to really be attentive to homework at home. Marisol was one of the more highly educated mothers that we met, and kind of had a sense about what it took to be successful in school because of her own experience. Granted, we also met other parents in the town, maybe with lower levels of formal education themselves, who had kind of an attitude that might be described as kind of a traditional attitude in a place like San Miguel Tlacotepeque, that well, I make sure my child gets to school and that they behave well, but really the formal education, the academic education, is really something I trust the teacher to do, and I trust that they do it. And I imagine that some of you see that with your students and families in the U.S., that those types of different narratives, right? They're often, what I'm finding in my research, are correlated with the level of formal education of the parents, but not always.
Any more questions? Well, we would like to thank you very much for doing this Skype meeting. Anyway, thank you.
It was a great. Well, it was a pleasure to get to know all of you, and I really wish you the best of luck. You know, keep on doing the great work that you're doing, and all right, so best to you. Buena suerte, viva la causa.
Viva la causa.